It all started with a wedding invitation. A crisp white envelope, gilded edges, my name written in swirling gold ink. It should have been a happy moment. A friend getting married, a celebration of love. But when I opened it and saw the names, my heart stopped. Emma and James. James, my boyfriend of 5 years. Emma, my best friend since childhood. The two people I trusted the most in the world. I sat on the floor of my apartment, the invitation trembling in my hands as the weight of the betrayal sank in. How could they do this to me? How could James have been with Emma behind my back, and how could Emma have kept it from me? My mind raced, replaying every moment. The subtle glances between them, the unexplained disappearances, the nights James was working late, while Emma mysteriously cancelled our plans. I should have seen it. I should have known. But love makes you blind and trust makes you stupid. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a blur of pain and confusion. Emma tried to explain once. She called me after I sent a curt congratulations in response to the invitation. I didn't mean for it to happen, she said, her voice cracking. Didn't mean for what to happen? I snapped. We got close. It just happened, she whispered. It just happened? My voice was sharp, cold. Did it just happen when you lied to my face every time we hung out? Did it just happen when you let me sit across from you at dinner, talking about how James was pulling away, while you knew exactly why? She was crying now, but I didn't care. I didn't want to hurt you, Emma said. Well, you did, I said. And you know what? You deserve each other. I hung up, and that was the last time we spoke before the wedding. I wasn't going to go. Why would I want to watch my best friend marry the man who had promised to spend his life with me? But something inside me, maybe pride, maybe anger, made me dress up that day and show up at the grand estate where they were holding the wedding. If they wanted to humiliate me, they weren't going to get the satisfaction of seeing me broken. The ceremony was already underway when I slipped in, unnoticed. Emma looked beautiful, a classic white dress, veil trailing behind her. James stood at the altar looking calm and confident. My stomach churned. I stood at the back, arms crossed, watching the man who had once sworn he loved me slip a ring on Emma's finger. I do, James said. Emma's smile widened. I do. A wave of nausea hit me. I turned and walked out before the kiss. Outside, I stood under the archway, breathing in the cool evening air, trying to steady the storm inside me. That's when I heard a voice behind me. Hey, are you okay? I turned and saw him. A man with dark eyes, tousled dark hair and a sharp jawline. He was dressed in a tailored suit, the top buttons of his shirt undone. He had a confidence about him, the kind of quiet self-assurance that didn't need to announce itself. I'm fine, I lied. He smiled knowingly. You don't look fine. Well, you try watching your best friend marry your boyfriend and see how fine you look. He raised an eyebrow. That kind of day. Exactly. He leaned against the wall beside me. I'm Daniel, by the way. Claire. So Claire, what's your plan now? My plan. You could leave quietly and lick your wounds, he said, his eyes glinting. Or you could make sure they know exactly what they've lost. I narrowed my eyes. And how would I do that? He smiled slowly. Stick with me. Daniel offered his arm, and I hesitated only for a second before linking my arm through his. We walked back into the reception together and heads turned. Daniel was strikingly handsome, the kind of man who commanded attention without trying. I could feel eyes on us as we crossed the room. James's eyes. Emma's eyes. We stopped near the bar. Daniel leaned down and whispered in my ear. Now comes the fun part. I laughed despite myself. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of power. James walked toward us, his jaw tight. Claire, he said stiffly. James, I replied. His eyes flicked toward Daniel. Who's this? I smiled sweetly. Oh, didn't I mention? This is Daniel. My date. James's gaze darkened. Daniel's arm slid around my waist and I saw the muscle in James's jaw tighten. You're moving on quickly, James said. Well, I said, you taught me not to waste time. James opened his mouth to say something else, but Emma appeared at his side. She looked between me and Daniel, her smile faltering. Claire, I didn't realize you were seeing someone, Emma said. I guess we both had secrets, I said, my voice light. Daniel chuckled. Shall we dance? He said, offering his hand. Absolutely, I said, not even looking at James or Emma as Daniel led me onto the dance floor. The music was soft, low, a classic waltz. Daniel's hand settled on my waist, his other hand holding mine. He moved with easy grace, guiding me through the steps. You're good at this, I said. I've had practice, he replied with a playful smile. What's your story, Daniel? I asked. Oh, you'll find out, he said, his eyes dark. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw James standing at the edge of the dance floor watching us. His face was carefully neutral, but I knew that look. He was furious. Good. You're enjoying this, Daniel said softly. What makes you think that? Because you're smiling, Daniel replied. I laughed. Maybe I am. As the song ended, Daniel dipped me, a dramatic theatrical move, and I saw James's jaw tighten. When Daniel pulled me upright, I was breathless. Feeling better? Daniel asked. Oh yes, I said. Much better. We walked off the dance floor. James was standing there, his fists clenched at his sides. Claire, can we talk? I smiled. Sorry, James. I'm busy. Daniel's hand slid to the small of my back as we walked toward the bar. This is fun, Daniel said. You have no idea, I replied. And for the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about James. The morning after the wedding, I woke up in Daniel's apartment. Not in his bed, let's be clear about that, but on his couch, wrapped in a thick gray blanket. Sunlight filtered through the large glass windows, casting soft shadows across the room. I sat up slowly, my head still buzzing from the previous night. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. I picked it up and saw a message from James. We need to talk. I scoffed. Of course we did. Now that he'd seen me with Daniel, now that I wasn't curled up in a ball nursing my wounds, James suddenly wanted to talk. Typical. Daniel's voice cut through my thoughts. You're up. I turned and saw him standing in the doorway, a towel slung over his shoulder, his dark hair wet from a shower. He was wearing only a pair of loose sweatpants, and the sight of his toned chest and sharp jawline momentarily threw me off balance. You let me sleep here? I asked. Daniel smirked. You passed out in the car. I wasn't about to let you stumble into your apartment at 3 a.m. Chivalry isn't dead after all. Not yet. He walked toward the kitchen and poured 2 cups of coffee, handing one to me as he sat down beside me on the couch. So, he said, what's the plan? The plan. Come on, he said, leaning back casually. I saw that look in your eyes last night. You're not done yet. I studied him for a moment, trying to gauge him. He was dangerous, not in the obvious sense but in the way he saw through me so easily. What makes you think I have a plan? Because you showed up to that wedding, Daniel said, his eyes gleaming. You could have stayed home and cried. But you didn't. You walked in with your head high, and you walked out with me. I sipped the coffee, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. And what exactly do you think my plan is? To make them pay, he said simply. I smiled faintly. Maybe. Daniel leaned in closer. Then let me help. I narrowed my eyes. Why would you want to help me? He smiled. Because I love a good revenge story. I shook my head. You don't even know me. Not yet, he said, his gaze darkening. The next day I walked into Emma's favorite coffee shop. She was sitting by the window, her hair styled in soft waves, wearing a delicate gold bracelet I had given her for her birthday years ago. Her eyes widened when she saw me. Claire, she said cautiously. I slid into the seat across from her. We need to talk, I said. Emma's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. I don't know if that's a good idea, she said. Oh, it's not, I said with a smile. Her eyes darted toward the door as if contemplating an escape. I just wanted to tell you something, I continued, keeping my voice light. You know Daniel, right? Her brow furrowed. Daniel. Yes. The man I was with at the wedding. Who is he? She asked. I leaned forward. Oh, just someone who knows how to treat me better than James ever did. Emma's lips parted. She looked almost jealous. I didn't know you were seeing someone, she said. I wasn't, I replied. But you know what they say when one door closes. Emma's smile tightened. That's fast, isn't it? I agreed. She was flustered. I was good. Planting the seed was important, because jealousy has a way of rotting even the closest bonds. As I stood to leave, I leaned down and whispered, "Don't worry, Emma. Daniel isn't the jealous type." 2 nights later, Daniel and I walked into one of the most exclusive clubs in the city. The lights were low, music pulsing through the floor beneath my feet. Daniel's hand rested on the small of my back as we walked toward the bar. I spotted James immediately. He was sitting at a VIP table with a few of his business partners. His eyes darkened the moment he saw me and Daniel. Daniel ordered drinks, his hand brushing against my arm as he leaned close. "He's watching you," Daniel said into my ear. "I know." A moment later, James appeared. "Claire," he said, his tone tight. I smiled brightly. "James. Fancy seeing you here." James's eyes narrowed toward Daniel. "You two seem close," James said. Daniel smiled. "Very close." James's eyes flashed. "Can we talk?" I tilted my head. "I don't know. Should I ask Daniel's permission?" Daniel chuckled softly. "I think you can handle this one," he said, stepping aside. James pulled me toward a quiet corner. "What are you doing?" James hissed. "Having a drink," I said. "With him." "You lost the right to care about who I spend my time with when you decided to marry my best friend," I said coolly. James ran a hand through his hair. "It's not that simple." "It is," I cut him off. James's eyes softened. "Claire, you know I didn't mean to hurt you." "But you did," I said. "And now you have Emma. Isn't that what you wanted?" "I thought it was," James said. His voice was quiet now, hesitant. "But when I saw you with him..." I smiled faintly. "Feeling regret?" James's jaw tightened. "I just want to know if you're happy," he said. "Are you?" I shot back. James opened his mouth to speak, but I turned and walked away before he could answer. Daniel was waiting at the bar, a knowing smile on his face. "How'd it go?" he asked. "Better than expected," I replied. Daniel leaned in, his lips brushing against my ear. "Then we're just getting started." The following week, Emma called me. "Claire," she said, her voice tight. "Yes." "Can we talk?" We met at the park. Emma looked pale, her eyes ringed with dark circles. "What's wrong?" I asked, playing innocent. "It's James," Emma said. "Oh." Emma bit her lip. "He's different. Ever since the wedding." "Different how?" Emma hesitated. "He keeps asking about you." I raised an eyebrow. "About me?" Emma nodded. "He's distant. Distracted. And last night he mentioned Daniel." I smiled faintly. "Maybe he's just wondering if he made the right choice." Emma's expression darkened. "You think he regrets marrying me?" "I don't know," I said, letting my words hang in the air. Emma's hands curled into fists. "Do you still love him?" I paused for a moment, long enough for Emma's doubt to grow. "I guess we'll see," I said softly. Emma's jaw tightened. She stood and walked away without another word. That night, I received a text from James. "Can we meet?" I hesitated for a moment, but only for show, before replying, "Sure." We met at a quiet rooftop bar overlooking the city skyline. James looked nervous. "You seem tense," I said, sitting across from him. James's eyes darkened. "I made a mistake." "Oh. I shouldn't have married Emma," James said. I smiled faintly. "That's too bad." James leaned forward, his hand brushing mine. "I miss you," he said. I pulled my hand away. "James," I said softly, "you're married." His eyes clouded with frustration. "Do you love him?" "Daniel." I smiled. "What do you think?" James's eyes hardened. I stood. "Good night, James." As I left, I saw Emma standing at the entrance, and the look on her face said she'd heard everything. I could feel it. The cracks were deepening, the fractures spreading through James and Emma's perfect little world. The foundation they had built on betrayal and secrecy was beginning to crumble, and I was the one holding the hammer. It wasn't about revenge anymore. Not entirely. It was about control. Power. After spending so long feeling powerless, after being lied to, discarded, and humiliated, I was taking the reins. And the best part? James and Emma were doing most of the work for me. I didn't need to force them to self-destruct. I just needed to give them a little push. 2 days after James's late-night confession, Daniel invited me to a charity gala at one of the city's most exclusive venues. Daniel was apparently the silent investor behind half the city's nightlife scene, and that meant access to places most people only dreamed of. "You look stunning," Daniel said as I slid into his sleek black car. "Is that a line?" I asked. He smiled. "Just an observation." I was wearing a fitted black dress with a plunging neckline and a high slit. Daniel's eyes lingered on me as we pulled away from the curb. "I assume James will be there?" Daniel said. "Of course. And Emma? She wouldn't miss it." Daniel smiled. "Then let's make sure they have a night to remember." The ballroom was filled with New York's elite, politicians, CEOs, celebrities. Chandeliers sparkled above us and a live string quartet played from the balcony. Daniel guided me through the crowd with an easy confidence, his hand resting on the small of my back. Heads turned when we walked in. I saw Emma and James almost immediately. Emma was in a pale blue dress, standing beside James, whose hand was resting protectively on her waist. Emma's smile was strained, her eyes darting toward us. James's expression, however, was pure tension. "Claire." James's voice was sharp as he approached us. Emma followed behind him, her eyes narrow. "James," I said with a cool smile. Daniel's hand slid around my waist. "Nice to see you again," Daniel said smoothly. James's jaw tightened. Emma forced a smile. "Claire, you look beautiful." "Thank you," I replied. Daniel picked the dress. Emma's smile faltered. "You two seem close," Emma said, her gaze shifting between us. "We've been spending a lot of time together," Daniel replied. "It's amazing how quickly you can connect when you meet the right person." James's eyes darkened. Daniel's hand slid up my waist. "Shall we dance?" I smiled. "Absolutely." Daniel led me onto the dance floor as the music slowed into a soft waltz. His hand rested on my lower back, his other hand capturing mine. He moved effortlessly, his eyes never leaving mine. "You're enjoying this," Daniel murmured. "Maybe a little," I admitted. Daniel's mouth curved into a smirk. "They're watching us." "I know." Daniel's hand tightened slightly on my waist. His lips brushed my ear. "What if I kissed you right now?" he whispered. My breath hitched. Then James would probably lose his mind. "Exactly." I pulled back slightly, meeting Daniel's dark gaze. "Do it." His lips captured mine, slow and deliberate. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a statement. A claim. I knew exactly who was watching. When we pulled apart, Daniel's eyes were dark. "Think that worked?" I smiled. "Oh, definitely." We walked off the dance floor. James was standing near the bar, his hand clenched into a fist at his side. Emma's face was pale, her eyes wide. "What the hell was that?" James hissed, his gaze flashing toward Daniel. "A dance," Daniel replied smoothly. "And a kiss." "You're making a fool of yourself, Claire," James snapped. "I'm not the one who cheated on my girlfriend with her best friend," I said coldly. James's mouth opened, but I was already turning away. Daniel smiled faintly. "Nice seeing you, James." Later that night, Daniel and I were sitting in his apartment. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey, handing one to me. "That was fun," Daniel said. "I'm starting to think you have a thing for drama," I replied. Daniel chuckled. "Maybe." I swirled the whiskey in my glass. "You really don't have to keep doing this, you know." "And miss the show?" Daniel's eyes gleamed. "Besides, I'm starting to like you." I hesitated. "Daniel." He reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. "I know what this is for you. And I'm okay with that." "You shouldn't be," I whispered. "Why not?" "Because this is a game." Daniel's gaze sharpened. And what if I don't mind playing? I opened my mouth to reply, but my phone buzzed. James, we need to talk. No. I sighed and set down the glass. Daniel raised an eyebrow. James. Yeah. Daniel leaned back. Want me to come with you? No, I said. I can handle this. James's apartment was a sleek high-rise with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. He opened the door almost immediately when I knocked. You didn't have to come, James said. You told me you needed to talk, I replied, stepping inside. James shut the door and turned toward me, his expression tense. What are you doing with him? James demanded. Daniel. I raised an eyebrow. You barely knew him a month ago, James said. Well, you barely knew Emma when you started sleeping with her, I replied. James's mouth tightened. That's different. Is it? James stepped closer. His eyes darkened. You don't love him. You don't know that. Yes, I do, James said. I backed up until I hit the wall. James's hands came to rest on either side of me, caging me in. James. His mouth was inches from mine. Tell me you don't still want me. My breath hitched. You're married. I don't care, James growled. He leaned in, but I turned my head at the last second, his mouth brushing my cheek instead of my lips. Too late, I whispered. James's jaw tightened. His hand slid to my waist and I pushed him back. You had your chance, I said. James's eyes flashed with frustration, but beneath it I saw something else. Regret. Panic. He was unraveling. Good. Go home to your wife, James, I said. I turned and walked away. This time James didn't try to stop me. Emma called me the next day. You need to stay away from him, she said, her voice sharp. Oh. I replied. You're trying to ruin my marriage. No, Emma, I said coldly. James is doing that all by himself. Emma's voice shook. He told me he regrets it. Marrying me. I smiled faintly. I'm sure he does. Emma's breath hitched. Do you still love him? Does it matter? I replied. There was silence on the other end of the line. I trusted you, Emma whispered. You shouldn't have. I hung up. 2 days later, Daniel and I were at a rooftop party. James and Emma were there too, but they weren't standing together. Emma looked pale, her eyes rimmed with red. James was drinking heavily, his eyes fixed on me. Daniel leaned down. It's almost over, isn't it? I smiled. Almost. James approached us. Claire, he said. James. James's gaze flicked toward Daniel. I made a mistake, James said. Big one, I replied. James stepped closer. I want you back. Daniel tensed beside me. I smiled faintly. That's too bad, I said. Why? Because I've already moved on. Daniel's hand slid around my waist. He kissed me and this time I kissed him back. When we pulled apart, James's expression was pure devastation. Goodbye, James, I said softly. James turned and walked away, and this time I knew he wouldn't be coming back. Daniel's hand tightened on my waist. You okay? He asked. Perfect, I replied. The fallout was delicious. James and Emma's picture-perfect marriage had cracked beyond repair. And the worst part, the most satisfying part, was that I didn't even have to lift a finger to make it happen. All I had to do was step into the space they created with their own betrayal and let nature take its course. I heard from mutual friends that James had moved out of their apartment the day after the rooftop party. Apparently, Emma had confronted him that night. She'd screamed, thrown things, and demanded to know if he was still in love with me. James hadn't denied it. That was all it took. But that wasn't enough for me. Not yet. James and Emma had left me humiliated. Broken. No. Now it was time for the real punishment to begin. Daniel and I were spending more and more time together. He wasn't just playing the role of the rebound anymore, he was becoming something more. I wasn't sure what exactly, but it was dangerous. We were at his apartment one evening, the city lights glittering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I was curled up on the couch, a glass of wine in hand, while Daniel stood at the bar, pouring himself whiskey. You've been quiet, Daniel said. I smiled faintly. Just thinking. About James, I admitted. Daniel's mouth twitched into a half-smile. Careful. Obsession can be dangerous. I'm not obsessed, I said. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Okay, maybe a little, I admitted. Daniel walked toward me and sat down, his arm draped over the back of the couch. Careful, Claire, he said softly. Revenge is addictive. You would know, I replied. His smile widened. That's why I'm telling you. I studied him for a moment. Daniel was a mystery, guarded and calculating, but there was something beneath that cold exterior. Something dark. Why are you helping me? I asked. Daniel's gaze sharpened. I told you. I like a good revenge story. And maybe I like you, he said simply. I opened my mouth to respond, but my phone buzzed. James, we need to talk. Please. I sighed and set the phone down. He's not giving up, Daniel said. I know. Daniel leaned closer. His hand slid up my thigh. Let me handle it, Daniel whispered. I smiled. Not yet. James showed up at my apartment the next evening. I opened the door and found him standing there, looking disheveled, dark circles under his eyes, shirt wrinkled. He looked nothing like the confident, controlled man I once knew. Claire, he said, his voice strained. What do you want? I asked. I need to talk to you. I hesitated, then stepped aside and let him in. He stood in the middle of my living room, running a hand through his hair. You look terrible, I said. James laughed bitterly. Yeah, well, I've had better weeks. I crossed my arms. Say what you came to say. James's eyes softened. I made a mistake. You've mentioned that. No, I mean it, James said. I thought Emma was what I wanted. But, I don't know. I guess I convinced myself that what we had was too easy, too safe. I scoffed. So you decided to screw my best friend? James winced. I'm sorry. Too late, I said. James stepped closer. His hand brushed my arm. You and Daniel. James's jaw tightened. It's serious? I smiled faintly. Maybe. James's eyes darkened. You don't love him. And you don't love Emma, I shot back. James's gaze sharpened. What if I left her? I froze. What? What if I walked away from her? What if I told her I wanted you? I took a shaky breath. You don't get to choose now, I said coldly. James's hand slid to my waist. Why not? Because you already made your choice, I said. James's mouth was inches from mine. I could feel his breath on my lips. I still want you, James said. I swallowed hard. And what about Emma? James's mouth curled into a bitter smile. She knows. I pushed him back. You need to leave. James's eyes darkened. I don't believe you, James said. I don't believe you don't still want me. My heart hammered in my chest. I don't, I whispered. James's gaze sharpened. Prove it, he said. Before I could react, Daniel walked into the room. Am I interrupting something? Daniel said smoothly. James's head snapped toward him. Daniel, James said, his tone low and dangerous. Daniel's smile didn't reach his eyes. James. James stepped toward him. This isn't your business. Daniel's mouth curled into a dangerous smile. Actually, I think it is. James's gaze flicked toward me. Claire. I met his gaze evenly. You should leave. James's jaw clenched. This isn't over, he said. I think it is, Daniel replied. James's gaze lingered on me for a long moment before he turned and left. When the door closed behind him, I exhaled shakily. Daniel smiled faintly. See, Daniel said. Addictive. It didn't take long for Emma to start unraveling. James had moved out, but Emma wasn't giving up without a fight. I heard from mutual friends that she was showing up at his office, calling him constantly. James was pulling away and everyone could see it. And then I gave her the final push. Daniel and I attended a charity event a week later. A high-profile fundraiser with press coverage. We posed for pictures on the red carpet, Daniel's hand resting possessively on my hip. He leaned down and whispered something in my ear. I smiled, laughed, and the cameras ate it up. The next morning the photos were everywhere. James's ex moves on with mysterious businessman. Emma saw them. I knew because she called me. You bitch, Emma hissed through the phone. Well, hello to you too, I said. You're doing this on purpose, Emma said. What exactly am I doing? You're trying to make James jealous, Emma snapped. Maybe, I said lightly. It won't work, Emma said. He loves me. Are you sure about that? Silence. Because from where I'm standing, I said, he looks pretty conflicted. Emma's breathing was ragged. You ruined my life, Emma whispered. No, Emma, I said coldly. You ruined your own life the moment you decided to betray me. I hung up. James showed up at my apartment later that night. I left her, James said. I raised an eyebrow. Really? I'm done, James said. It's always been you. He stepped closer, cupping my face in his hands. Claire, I'm so sorry, James said. I love you. I smiled faintly. I believe you, I said. James's eyes lit up. Then, but it's too late, I said softly. James's expression darkened. I needed you to choose me then, I said. Not now. James's jaw tightened. Claire. I shook my head. You gave me up. And I've already moved on. Daniel appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. James's eyes flashed. You're making a mistake, James said. No, I said. I'm fixing the one you made. James's gaze hardened. You'll regret this, James said. No, I said. You will. James left. Daniel smiled. Well done, Daniel said. It's over, I whispered. Daniel's hand slid around my waist. Tao what? Daniel asked. Now, I said, we live. Daniel leaned down and kissed me, slow, deep, and this time I didn't think about James. Not even once. It had been weeks since James walked away. Weeks since Emma disappeared from my life entirely. The storm had passed and I had won. The victory was mine. James and Emma had destroyed each other, and I had been the one to light the spark that burned it all down. But now that the dust had settled, I wasn't sure why I wasn't happier. Daniel and I were together constantly now. Late nights in his apartment, quiet evenings with wine and laughter, stolen glances that meant more than either of us was willing to admit. He had become more than just an accomplice in my revenge. He had become a part of me. And that was terrifying. Because Daniel was a mystery. Even after all this time I could feel him holding back, hiding something. He had become the center of my world, but I was beginning to realize I still didn't really know him. One night, we were sitting on Daniel's balcony, the lights of the city glowing beneath us. Daniel had his arm draped over my shoulder, his thumb tracing slow, lazy circles along my collarbone. You've been quiet, Daniel said softly. I smiled faintly. Just thinking. About what? You. Daniel's gaze sharpened. What about me? I hesitated. You're hiding something, I said. Daniel's smile faded. I turned toward him, searching his face. You know almost everything about me, I said. But you've never told me anything about yourself. Why did you help me? Why were you so invested in my revenge? Daniel's eyes darkened. His hand dropped from my shoulder. I told you, he said. I like a good revenge story. That's not the truth, I whispered. Daniel sighed and leaned back against the railing. He rubbed a hand across his face, his expression hard. There was someone before you, Daniel said finally. My heart skipped. Who? Her name was Jessica, Daniel said. I froze. Jessica. Daniel's gaze was distant now, his expression shadowed by something dark and painful. We were engaged, Daniel said. Years ago. I swallowed. What happened? Daniel's jaw tightened. She left me. Why? Daniel hesitated. She cheated, he said finally. His voice was sharp. I thought she loved me. I thought we were building a life together. And then one night I came home and found her packing her things. She didn't even try to lie about it, she just said it was over. I took a shaky breath. Did she leave you for someone else? Yes. My stomach twisted. Who? My best friend. My heart sank. And you never tried to fix it? I asked. Daniel's eyes darkened. Why would I? I swallowed. That's why you helped me, I whispered. Because you know how it feels. Daniel's eyes met mine. Yes. I reached for his hand. Daniel. His gaze softened. I wasn't going to let them get away with it, Daniel said. And when I saw what James and Emma did to you, I couldn't stand by and watch. I squeezed his hand. You never told me, I said. You didn't ask. Daniel's gaze darkened as he leaned in, his face inches from mine. I know how it feels, Daniel whispered. To be betrayed by the people you trust the most. That's why I couldn't walk away from you. My breath hitched. You're not alone anymore, Claire, Daniel said. Not as long as I'm here. And then he kissed me. It wasn't like the other kisses, the strategic, calculated displays meant to make James jealous. This kiss was slow and real, deep and consuming. His hands slid into my hair and I melted into him, my arms curling around his neck. My heart was racing. Because this wasn't part of the game anymore. This was real. 2 days later, James showed up at my door. I opened it and found him standing there looking uncertain. Claire, James said. What are you doing here? I needed to see you, James said. I crossed my arms. You don't get to do this. Claire, I know I messed up, James said. But I'm trying to fix it. I shook my head. No, James, I said softly. You're not trying to fix it. You're trying to rewrite history. James's eyes darkened. You loved me, James said. I did, I replied. But that was before. James stepped closer. What if I told you I still love you? James asked. I smiled faintly. I'd tell you that you should have figured that out before you walked down the aisle with Emma. James's mouth tightened. Claire. It's over, I said softly. You're choosing him, James said, his voice sharp. Yes, I replied. Why? Because Daniel was there when you weren't, I said. Because he didn't betray me. James's jaw tightened. You'll regret this, James said. I smiled faintly. I don't think I will. James stared at me for a long moment and then he left. And this time I knew it was for good. Emma left the city. I heard from mutual friends that she had gone to California to figure things out. She didn't try to call me. She didn't send any messages. I suppose that was for the best. Some things can't be forgiven. And Emma knew that. Daniel and I were walking along the waterfront one night, the city lights reflecting off the dark water. Daniel's hand was in mine, his thumb brushing along my wrist. I have a confession, Daniel said. Oh. I never expected this, Daniel said. Expected what? To fall for you, Daniel said. My heart skipped. I didn't expect it either, I said softly. Daniel stopped walking. He turned toward me, his hand resting against my jaw. I thought this was just about revenge, Daniel said. So did I whispered. Daniel's gaze darkened. But it's more than that now, Daniel said. Yes, I whispered. Daniel leaned in, his lips brushing against mine. You scare me, Daniel said. I smiled faintly. Good. Daniel's mouth curled into a dangerous smile. Do you trust me? Daniel asked. I hesitated, but only for a second. Yes, I said. Daniel kissed me, slow and deep. I'm not going anywhere, Daniel whispered. Good, I whispered back. A week later I found myself standing on a rooftop overlooking the city. Daniel stood beside me, his arm wrapped around my waist. This is where it ends, I said softly. No, Daniel replied. This is where it begins. I smiled faintly. James and Emma were the past. Daniel was the future. And for the first time in a long time I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about the future. About Daniel. You ready? Daniel asked. Yes, I said. Daniel's mouth curled into a smile. Then let's go. We walked away together, hand in hand. And I didn't look back. It's funny how life has a way of circling back to the places you swore you'd never visit again. I spent years rebuilding myself from the ground up after James and Emma's betrayal. I told myself I was done with love. done with trusting anyone enough to give them the power to hurt me. And yet here I was, standing in front of the mirror in a white dress, the lace trailing behind me like a ghost. My heart was racing and my hands trembled as I adjusted the delicate pearl earrings hanging from my ears. Behind me, the large windows of the bridal suite overlooked the lush gardens of the estate where Daniel and I would be married in less than an hour. The sun was high, casting soft golden light over the green lawns and white roses lining the walkway. Guests were already gathering outside. I could hear the soft hum of conversation drifting through the open windows. "You look beautiful." I turned toward the door and saw Emma standing there. My chest tightened. "Emma," I said softly. She smiled faintly. Her hair was pulled into a simple bun and she wore a pale blue dress. The color she used to say made her eyes stand out. "Surprised?" Emma asked. "A little," I admitted. "Daniel invited me," Emma said. I raised an eyebrow. "He didn't tell me that." Emma's smile tightened. "He thought you'd appreciate the gesture." I studied her for a moment. "I didn't think you'd come," I said. "I almost didn't," Emma replied. "But you were right. About everything." I folded my arms. "It took you long enough." Emma sighed. "I'm not expecting us to ever go back to the way we were," Emma said. "I know that's not possible." "No, it's not," I agreed. Emma's eyes softened. "But I'm happy for you," she said quietly. A long silence stretched between us. "You mean that?" I asked. "Yes," Emma said. For a moment I let my guard drop. "Thank you," I whispered. Emma smiled faintly, then took a step toward me. "Can I fix your veil?" she asked. I hesitated, then nodded. Emma's fingers were steady as she adjusted the delicate lace, her touch light. "There," she said. I smiled at her through the mirror. "For what it's worth," Emma said softly, "I think Daniel's the right one for you." "I know he is," I replied. Emma smiled faintly, then stepped back. "I should go find a seat," Emma said. I watched her walk away, wondering if this was the closest we would ever come to forgiveness. Maybe it was enough. I stood at the edge of the aisle, my heart thundering in my chest. The music swelled, a soft orchestral piece that filled the summer air with warmth. The guests stood, their eyes turning toward me. And then I saw him. Daniel stood at the end of the aisle waiting for me. He wore a tailored black suit, the crisp white of his shirt glowing in the sunlight. His dark hair was swept back and his eyes, those sharp, intense eyes, softened when they met mine. He smiled. The kind of smile that made my knees go weak. The kind of smile that told me everything was going to be okay. My father offered me his arm. "You ready?" he asked. I smiled. "Yes." I walked down the aisle toward Daniel, my dress trailing behind me, my heart hammering in my chest. But with every step the nerves faded. By the time I reached him I was calm. Daniel reached out and took my hand. "Hi," he whispered. "Hi," I whispered back. The officiant smiled. "Shall we begin?" Daniel held my hand, his thumb brushing along the edge of my palm as he spoke his vows. "Claire," Daniel said, his voice steady, "the day I met you I knew you were trouble." The guests chuckled softly. "But what I didn't know was how much you would change me," Daniel continued. "I thought I knew everything about control, about strategy, about winning. But then you showed up and you didn't play by any of the rules. You tore down every wall I built and you made me see that life isn't about control. It's about trust. About love." My throat tightened. "I promised to protect you, to stand beside you and to let you tear down my walls whenever you need to. I promised to love you, even when it's hard, even when you drive me crazy, because you are the only person who's ever truly seen me. And I am yours, forever." Tears blurred my vision. "Claire?" the officiant prompted gently. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to steady my breath as I spoke my vows. "Daniel," I said softly, "when I met you I didn't trust anyone. I had been broken, betrayed. And then you walked into my life and offered me something I didn't even realize I needed." Daniel's eyes darkened. "You stood beside me when I was at my lowest. You fought for me even when I wasn't sure I was worth fighting for. You taught me that love isn't weakness, it's strength. And you showed me that I'm not alone anymore. Daniel's hand tightened around mine. I promise to love you, even when you're impossible, even when you make me crazy, even when you drive me to the edge. I promise to trust you even when it's hard. And I promise to stand beside you no matter what. Daniel's gaze softened. I'm yours, I whispered. Forever. The officiant smiled. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Daniel's hand slid around my waist as he leaned down. You're mine now, he whispered. I smiled. And you're mine. Daniel kissed me deep and sure, and the guests erupted into applause. The reception was held beneath a large white tent, with chandeliers glowing beneath the night sky. The tables were lined with white roses and candles. Soft jazz played in the background. Daniel and I sat at the head table, his hand resting on my knee beneath the tablecloth. He leaned over and kissed the side of my head. You look beautiful, Daniel whispered. So do you, I replied. James was there. He stood at the edge of the reception watching us. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes. Resignation maybe. Acceptance. Emma was seated near the back. Her gaze met mine once, and for the first time in years I saw no bitterness there. Just quiet understanding. Maybe we were all moving on. Daniel stood and offered his hand. Shall we? I smiled and took his hand. We walked to the center of the dance floor and the band began to play. Daniel's hand slid to my waist as he guided me through the dance. You're shaking, Daniel said softly. Nerves, I admitted. You don't have to be nervous anymore, Daniel whispered. I've got you. I smiled. I know. Daniel leaned down and kissed me again. The guests applauded. And in that moment, beneath the soft glow of the chandeliers, Daniel's hands steady against me, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. Later that night Daniel and I sat beneath the stars. He had loosened his tie and my shoes were discarded beneath the table. My head rested on his shoulder. What now? I whispered. Daniel smiled faintly. Now, he said. Now we build something better. Daniel's hand slid beneath my chin as he turned my face toward him. I love you, Daniel said. I love you, I replied. Daniel's mouth curved into a smile. Then let's make this last. And as Daniel kissed me beneath the stars, I knew we already had.